The night my future mother-in-law insulted me in French, she was not wrong about everything. I was sitting in a borrowed dress at a table I did not belong at, pretending to be someone I had spent 4 years carefully erasing. What she got wrong was the reason. My name is Claire Whitfield. I am 32 years old, and for the 11 months leading up to the events of the story, I was living what looked from the outside like a very small life. Studio apartment in Hartford, Connecticut. Modest wardrobe. A freelance translation business that paid the bills if the bills stayed modest. I drove a 7-year-old Honda and kept my grocery receipts in a folder because old habits from leaner years die slowly even when the years stop being lean. Ethan Caldwell's family looked at all of that and saw exactly what I needed them to see. A woman grateful for the upgrade. What they did not see, because I worked hard to make sure they could not, was that I had spent the previous 4 years building a data localization software company called Vericore Solutions from a kitchen table in that same small apartment. By the time Ethan proposed to me on a rooftop in Boston on a cold November evening, Vericore had 41 employees, contracts with 2 Fortune 500 companies, and a valuation that my attorneys kept reminding me I needed to protect before I signed any marriage license. I had been losing sleep over how to raise the subject of a prenuptial agreement without breaking the careful cover story I had constructed. I was not ready to explain myself yet. I needed to understand what I was actually walking into first. I want to be honest about something, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves a clean narrative. I loved Ethan once. Or I loved the version of him he showed me in the first few months, the one who stayed up late talking about ideas, who remembered small things I mentioned in passing, who made me feel like my quietness was something worth paying attention to rather than something to fix. I am not sure exactly when that person was replaced by the one I eventually had to face. Probably it was gradual. Probably there were signs I chose not to read because reading them would have required me to act on them, and I was not ready. That is the part of the story I am least proud of. Not the ending. The middle, where I kept making excuses. The dinner that forced me to stop making excuses happened on a Tuesday evening in early April at the Caldwell family's private country club in Westport. The Whitmore Club was the kind of place where the carpet was thick enough to muffle not just footsteps, but entire conversations, and where the staff had perfected the specific art of being invisible to members while remaining entirely attentive. Gerald and Margaret Caldwell had been members for 22 years. Their table in the corner by the window was, I had been told, always their table. Margaret arrived wearing a double strand of pearls and the particular expression of a woman who has decided the outcome of an evening before it begins. Gerald was already working on his second bourbon. Ethan sat beside me and spent the appetizer course complaining about the wine selection and the slowness of the service in a way that I had learned meant he was anxious about something he was not saying out loud. I was wearing a simple navy dress I had owned for 3 years. I had chosen it deliberately. Around the Caldwell family, I had developed a habit of dressing down, presenting the version of myself that matched their expectations, partly because it was easier and partly because I had learned early that Margaret's cruelty was significantly more revealing when she felt comfortable enough to deploy it freely. Comfortable people make mistakes. I had been waiting patiently for a useful one. The appetizer plates were being cleared when Margaret turned to Ethan and said something in French. Her accent was polished in the way that suggested years of lessons rather than years of actual use. She said it at a conversational volume, not loudly, but not quietly either. The kind of volume that says I am not hiding this, I simply do not believe you can hear me. She called me painfully ordinary. She said it with a small smile, as though it were a fond observation rather than a verdict. Ethan laughed. It was not a polite laugh or an uncomfortable one. It was genuine and relaxed, and it hit me somewhere specific. I had spent 3 years in Lyon in my mid-20s working as a senior interpreter for an international trade organization. My French was not tourist French. It was the kind that makes actual French people pause before they compliment it. I waited 4 full seconds. Long enough to give Ethan a window to say something, to redirect, to simply change the subject. He refilled his wine glass instead. That was the moment, if I am being precise about it. Not the insult. The refill. I folded my napkin carefully and set it beside my plate. I looked at Margaret and responded in French, calmly and without raising my voice, that ordinary women rarely build companies from nothing. The silence that followed was immediate and total. Margaret's expression did not crumble. It sharpened. And then Gerald reached into the leather briefcase beside his chair and placed a thick rubber-banded document on the table directly in front of my plate. 50 pages. His family's attorneys had clearly spent real money on it. A prenuptial agreement. Aggressive, comprehensive, and designed with one specific purpose: to ensure I left with nothing. I picked it up and began to read. And within the first 3 pages, I found something that made my hand go very still on the table. A full waiver of liability for spousal debts. The word debts. My private investigator had flagged Gerald's real estate firm 2 weeks earlier as showing signs of serious financial distress. I had not yet understood how serious. But sitting at that table, holding that document, I began to. They had just handed me exactly what my corporate attorneys had been asking me to obtain for months. I looked at Gerald. I looked at Ethan. I uncapped my pen and signed my name on the signature line without reading another word. The morning after I signed that prenuptial agreement, I called my CFO before the coffee finished brewing and told her we needed to go deeper. What Sandra found over the next 48 hours was not just worse than I expected. It was worse than I had allowed myself to imagine, and I had been imagining some fairly dark possibilities. I should say that Sandra had been with Vericore since the 2nd year, when the company was still operating out of my apartment and our entire tech stack was running on 2 refurbished laptops and a prayer. She was meticulous, unflappable, and constitutionally incapable of softening bad news, which was exactly the quality I needed in a CFO and also the quality that occasionally made our Monday morning calls genuinely difficult to get through. When she called me back at 11 that night, her voice had the specific flatness it got when the numbers were bad enough that emotion felt beside the point. Gerald Caldwell's commercial real estate firm had leveraged 4 properties against each other in a structure that any first-year banking student would have recognized as unsustainable. 3 of those properties were in active delinquency. The flagship Harbor Street building, the one Gerald referenced at dinner with the casual pride of a man describing a family heirloom, had 3 separate liens from 3 different lenders, all of whom were already in internal discussions about foreclosure timelines. The Caldwell fortune that Margaret wore like a second skin was not generational wealth. It was generational performance. The money had been leaving quietly for years, and the lifestyle had simply refused to follow it out the door. Then Sandra pulled Ethan's trust fund records through the international financial databases we used legally for Vericore's overseas acquisitions. I had been sitting at my kitchen table for this call. When Sandra read me the transaction history, I stood up and walked to the window and stood there for a while without saying anything. The trust had been systematically emptied over 4 years. Not gradually in the way of someone living beyond their means. Quickly in the way of someone losing tens of thousands of dollars at a time, transferred to offshore sports betting platforms, unregulated online gambling accounts, and 2 entities that Sandra flagged as likely fronts for illegal casino operations. Ethan's trust fund, the financial security blanket he referenced in almost every conversation about our future, had been gone for years. He had been describing an empty account like it was a full one. Every time he made me feel financially inadequate by comparison, he was performing a fiction. I want to be careful here about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. It was not satisfaction. It was something closer to grief, briefly, for the relationship I had genuinely tried to invest in before I understood its actual architecture. I had not started this process wanting to dismantle anyone. I told him I was nervous about taking on debt, but that I trusted his judgment and would call my bank on Monday morning to look at options. The relief on his face was immediate and unguarded and told me more than anything he said out loud. I walked him to the door, watched his car pull away, and then sat down on my kitchen floor for about 4 minutes doing nothing at all. Sometimes you need a moment before you begin. Then I got up, opened my laptop, and sent Sandra a message authorizing her to begin researching the acquisition of Gerald's delinquent commercial loans directly from his lenders. If they were going to use my name and my supposed financial desperation to save their sinking empire, I was going to own the rope they were drowning in. The rehearsal dinner was in 4 days. I had work to do. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Dale sent me an audio file with a subject line that simply read, "Dashboard camera, last night. Listen before you do anything else." I made a cup of tea I did not drink, sat down at my kitchen table, and pressed play. The recording opened with the sound of a car door closing hard. Then an engine. The first few minutes were unremarkable, just Ethan muttering to himself over the radio, the kind of ambient irritation that follows a difficult conversation. Then the navigation system announced an arrival in Fairfield, a town 40 minutes from my apartment, and the engine cut off. I had assumed Ethan went home after leaving my place. He had not gone home. The address the navigation announced belonged to Brooke Weston, a local real estate agent who had been a fixture at Caldwell family events for the past 3 years. Margaret mentioned her frequently and warmly. Ethan had introduced her to me at a Christmas party the previous year as an old family friend, which is the kind of description that technically contains no lies and communicates nothing true. I had noticed the way Ethan's posture changed when Brooke was in the room and filed it away in the category of things I did not yet have enough information to act on. The Bluetooth connection from Ethan's phone remained active after he went inside. The car system recorded everything. I heard a door open, Brooke's voice bright and expectant, the sound of something being poured over ice. She asked him how dinner with the sad little translator had gone. He laughed. Not the short, deflecting laugh of a man who feels guilty. The full, relaxed laugh of a man who feels at home. He told her I was being stubborn about the apartment equity. He said he was running out of angles before the wedding and that his father was getting desperate. Then his voice dropped and the recording caught every word with a clarity that felt almost unkind in its precision. He told her to be patient. He said once the money moved into Dominic's fund they would pull their share, he would file for divorce within the year, and I would be left holding the liability from a federal fraud collapse with no assets and no legal recourse because the prenuptial agreement his father had insisted on would protect him from any counterclaim I might attempt. He had planned it completely. The wedding was not a beginning. It was a mechanism. A legal structure designed to extract one specific thing from me and then deposit me, financially ruined, on the other side of a divorce proceeding. Brooke laughed at something he said after that, and I stopped the recording because I had heard everything I needed to hear. I sat with it for a while. I am not going to pretend the recording did not affect me, because that would not be honest. There was a version of the previous 11 months in which I had genuinely tried. I had made compromises and adjustments and quiet sacrifices that I had told myself were the normal currency of building a life with another person. Hearing the recording did not make me angry in the loud, reactive way. It made me very quiet in a way that felt permanent. After a while I got up and called Marcus. Marcus Chin was the senior partner on my corporate legal team, a man who communicated primarily in precise declarative sentences and who I trusted completely precisely because he never told me what I wanted to hear. I gave him the short version. He was silent for a moment and then said, in exactly the tone I expected, that this was actually clarifying and that we should accelerate the timeline. I agreed. I told him I wanted everything ready by Saturday morning. He said he would have it done by Friday night. That was the entire conversation. The rehearsal dinner was held the following evening at a private waterfront estate in Westport that Gerald had rented at a cost that, according to Sandra's research, had been charged to a corporate credit card already 90 days past due. Crystal chandeliers. Imported orchids in tall glass vases. A catered menu with a per-head cost that made my actual corporate event budget look conservative. It was a performance of solvency staged by people who were weeks away from insolvency, which gave the entire evening a specific quality, like watching someone rearrange furniture very carefully in a house that is on fire. I wore the emerald silk dress. I want to be straightforward about the choice. For 11 months I had dressed down around the Caldwells, not out of insecurity but out of strategy. Plain clothes kept Margaret comfortable and comfortable people reveal themselves. But that night I was done with the costume. The dress was a signal, though not to the room in general. It was a signal to myself that a different phase had begun. Ethan saw me walk in and went still mid-conversation. His eyes moved over the dress in the calculating way of someone trying to reconcile new information with an existing model. He crossed the room and asked where I had gotten it, pitching his voice as casual and missing by a noticeable margin. I told him I had been saving it for a special occasion. He smiled with his mouth. Margaret found me within minutes and did what Margaret did, steering me into a circle of her socialite friends and introducing me as Ethan's philanthropic endeavor. Her friends were gracious in the technically accurate sense, meaning they said the correct words while their eyes conducted a thorough and unfavorable inventory. Margaret reached out and rubbed the fabric of my sleeve between her fingers, commenting loudly on whether it might be a blend, suggesting she had nearly sent her housekeeper to my apartment with something more appropriate for the evening. Two of her friends laughed. One looked away. I noted that small detail and filed it. I excused myself a few minutes later, citing the need for air, and moved quietly through the crowd toward the terrace. Gerald was outside alone, his back to the doors, his phone pressed hard against his ear. His hand was trembling in a way that his cufflinks made audible. I positioned myself behind a tall floral arrangement just inside the glass doors and activated the recording application on my phone. What I heard confirmed and exceeded everything Sandra had uncovered. Gerald was begging. The word is not too strong. He was begging a loan officer for 72 hours, promising a cash infusion that everyone in that phone call understood was contingent on money that did not yet exist. He mentioned his Harbor Street property by name. He said if the bank moved on Monday, he would lose everything in a cross-default chain, and there would be nothing left to negotiate with. His voice cracked once, briefly, and he cleared his throat hard to cover it. I stopped the recording, uploaded the file, and walked back inside. I found my seat at the main table. Dominic arrived 20 minutes late with Renata, depositing his car keys on the white linen with a clatter that I had come to recognize as a standard opening move, a small dominance display he had probably stopped noticing he was making. He spotted me from across the table and began his approach with the particular energy of a man who had been briefed on my supposed financial vulnerability and was looking forward to deploying that information creatively. He asked in front of 6 people whether the little translator had finally decided to stop being so precious about her modest nest egg. I looked at him without any particular expression and said that unlike some people at this table, I had always been careful about spending money that actually belonged to me. The smirk on Dominic's face did not disappear. It hesitated. For approximately 1 second his eyes moved sideways in the way that eyes move when a person runs a rapid private calculation. Then the smirk came back, slightly less certain than before, and he made a joke that got a polite laugh from Renata. But I had seen that hesitation. He was not as confident as he performed. Somewhere underneath the custom suit and the ordered scotch, Dominic Farrell knew exactly how thin the ice beneath him was. My phone vibrated once against my leg. Dale. The federal package was confirmed and the deployment window was locked for Saturday morning. I stood up near the end of the dinner, tapped my water glass, and told the room I had a financial surprise prepared for Ethan that I would deliver at the altar on Saturday. The relief that moved through the table was almost physical. Gerald's shoulders dropped 2 inches. Ethan grabbed my hand. Dominic raised his glass. They believed they had broken me. They believed the apartment money was coming and that the hardest part was behind them. I sat back down and finished my water and said nothing else for the rest of the evening. Let them sleep well, I thought. Saturday was close enough. I did not sleep much the night before the wedding. Not from anxiety. From the specific alertness that comes when you have been building towards something for a long time and the morning of it has finally arrived and your mind simply refuses to stand down. I was in the bridal suite at the Riverside Botanical Garden by 7 in the morning. The venue was extraordinary in the objective way that expensive places engineered by talented people tend to be. White chairs arranged in precise rows across manicured lawns. Ivory roses woven through iron archways. Ancient oaks throwing long morning shadows across a bluestone path that led to an altar draped in white silk. Gerald and Margaret had committed their last available financial resources to this spectacle, which meant the beauty of it had a specific irony that I noticed and set aside. Sandra confirmed the final acquisition at 7:42. Veracor Capital had successfully purchased the full portfolio of Gerald's delinquent commercial loans from 4 separate lenders, all of whom had been quietly relieved to offload the risk. We also held the mortgage note on the Caldwell family's residential estate in Greenwich, purchased from a secondary lender who had been carrying it at a loss for 8 months. As of that morning, every significant asset attached to the Caldwell name was secured against debt that I controlled. I had not done this for drama. I had done it because my attorneys advised that acquiring the debt was the cleanest legal mechanism for ensuring Vericor's exposure was fully contained regardless of how Saturday went. The drama was incidental. Marcus arrived at the garden at 8 with a black leather binder and 4 members of my corporate legal team. all of whom were dressed conservatively enough to be mistaken for wedding guests until you noticed they were all standing very still near the rear entrance, with the particular patience of people waiting for a specific signal. I had placed a sealed envelope under the altar table during the rehearsal walk through the previous morning. One of Marcus's associates confirmed it was still there. I want to say something about the dress, because I think it is relevant. The gown was custom-made by an Italian atelier I had worked with once before on a corporate event, hand-stitched silk with a subtle crystal detail along the bodice that caught light without announcing itself. I had ordered it 8 months earlier, before any of this had fully developed, back when I was still trying to figure out whether the relationship was salvageable and had not yet answered that question honestly. Wearing it felt strange. Not wrong, but strange. Like wearing something that had been made for a different version of an occasion. The guests began arriving at 9:30. 300 people, the fullest cross-section of Connecticut old money that the Caldwells could assemble on 6 weeks' notice. Many of them were also, according to Dale's research, investors in Dominic's fund. Some of them were about to have a very significant morning for reasons they did not yet know. Ethan was at the altar when I appeared at the far end of the aisle. I watched his expression move through surprise, then rapid recalculation, then something that settled into triumphant relief. He thought the dress meant the money was coming. He thought the upgrade in my appearance confirmed that I had accepted my role in the plan and was dressing the part. He reached for my hands when I arrived and squeezed them with a warmth that I recognized as the warmth of anticipated payment rather than the warmth of a person who loves you. I had learned to tell the difference. The officiant began the ceremony. He was a thoughtful man in his late 60s who had clearly officiated hundreds of these events and who delivered the opening remarks with genuine feeling, which made me feel briefly sorry that his afternoon was about to become a story he would tell for the rest of his career. When he reached the traditional moment and asked whether anyone present had cause to object, the garden settled into that expectant hush. That was my cue. I released Ethan's hands. He felt it immediately. A question moved across his face. I turned toward the back of the garden and nodded once to the audiovisual technician, a young man named Kevin who I had paid triple his standard rate and who had been given one instruction: follow my signal, not the family's. The string quartet stopped. And then the garden filled with the sound of Ethan's own voice, pouring out of the speaker system at full volume and with complete clarity. The dashboard recording played from the beginning. The guests heard the car door, the engine, the navigation announcing the arrival in Fairfield. They heard Brooke's voice. They heard Ethan laugh at my expense with the ease of someone who had been laughing at my expense for a long time. And then they heard him, in his own unhurried voice, describe the plan. The apartment equity. Dominic's fund. The divorce. Leaving me to absorb the liability from a federal fraud collapse while he and Brooke disappeared toward something more comfortable. 300 people sat in absolute silence. I watched faces move through disbelief, then recognition, then a kind of collective recalibration. Several of the men in the audience were already reaching for their phones. Ethan grabbed the lapel microphone and began talking over the recording, his voice rising quickly past the threshold of credibility. He said it was fabricated. He said I had used AI to manufacture evidence because I was unstable and jealous. He said his financial situation was completely sound and that anyone who knew him knew he was incapable of this. He said it loudly and repeatedly and with decreasing coherence as the recording continued beneath his denials. I reached under the altar table and retrieved the envelope. I removed the bank documents. Every page of the trust fund transaction history, every wire transfer, every account number associated with 4 years of systematic gambling losses. I held the stack up and released it into the light morning breeze. The pages caught the air and scattered across the white petals, and the front row guests reached down and picked them up and read them, and the murmuring that moved through the crowd was low and continuous, and had the quality of something that cannot be taken back. Ethan dropped to his knees trying to collect the pages, and I understood in that moment that the arrogant, composed man I had spent 11 months trying to reconcile with the man I first met was completely gone. What was left was someone much smaller, scrambling in the grass on the most photographed morning of his life. I took the microphone from the officiant, who surrendered it with the expression of a man making a rapid and correct assessment of where authority currently resided. The garden had gone completely still in the particular way that large groups of people go still when they realize they are witnessing something that has moved beyond the possibility of a graceful recovery for anyone involved. I did not raise my voice. There was no need. The sound system was excellent. I told the guests that I wanted to address something that affected several of them directly. I told them that Dominic Farrell's investment fund was not what it had been represented as being. That the consistent high returns he advertised were not the product of any legitimate market strategy. That new investor capital had been used to pay earlier investors while the principal was redirected to fund a lifestyle, and that the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been building a case against the fund for the better part of a year. I told them that federal agents were present on the property and that Dominic would be taken into custody this morning. I looked at Dominic when I said it. He had been sitting very still for the previous 2 minutes, his champagne glass still raised halfway from when he had toasted my supposed surrender the previous evening. The glass came down slowly. His face did something complicated. The performance of wealth and confidence and casual superiority that he had been running successfully for years simply switched off. And what was underneath it was a man who had always known this morning existed somewhere in his future and had simply been hoping it was further away. He moved fast. I will give him that. He pushed back from his chair and was on his feet and moving toward the side gate before most of the guests had processed what I had said. He got perhaps 50 feet. 2 federal agents stepped out from behind an oak tree where they had been standing since 8:30 that morning and intercepted him cleanly. The sound of handcuffs is not dramatic in real life. It is a small mechanical click that somehow carries further than it should. In the silence of that garden it reached every row. The agents walked Dominic back through the garden to the federal vehicles parked at the main entrance, and he passed within 15 feet of the guests he had defrauded, and nobody looked away. Renata was on the ground near the front row, her composure entirely gone, which was the most human I had ever seen her. I felt something toward her that was not quite sympathy but was adjacent to it. She had not known, or at least I had no evidence that she had. Being married to a fraud is its own particular catastrophe, and she was only beginning to understand the shape of hers. Gerald moved next. He had been standing at the edge of the altar area since the recording played, and watching him process the sequence of events had been like watching someone manually reboot a system that kept failing. When he finally spoke, it was in the aggressive register of a man trying to recover authority through volume. He threatened litigation. He listed legal terms with the fluency of someone who had spent years around attorneys and knew how the vocabulary of the law could be used to create the impression of power even when the actual power was gone. He said he would have my assets frozen, my company tied up in injunctions, my reputation dismantled through every channel available to a family of their standing. I let him finish. Then I asked him calmly how he planned to fund that litigation. Marcus walked up the aisle and placed the black leather binder on the altar table. I opened it and turned it toward Gerald. The Vericore capital seal was embossed in gold on the cover page. I told him that as of 7:42 that morning, every delinquent commercial loan attached to his real estate firm had been acquired by my holding company. I told him the Harbor Street building, the one he had described at dinner like it was a monument to his family's permanence, was now subject to foreclosure proceedings initiated by its new lien holder. I told him that the residential estate in Greenwich, where he and Margaret had lived for 19 years, was mortgaged against a note that Vericore now held. I told him he was currently standing on property that belonged to me. Gerald read the first page of the binder. He read it the way people read things they are hoping will turn out to say something different than it says. Then he sat down on the altar steps, heavily and without ceremony, and the bravado went out of him like air from something punctured. Margaret had been standing behind him through all of this, gripping her pearl necklace with both hands. When Gerald sat down, something in her grip changed and the strand snapped, sending pearls scattering across the bluestone path and into the grass and between the chair legs of the front row. She did not reach for them. She stood looking at the binder on the altar table, and I think in that moment, for the first time in the 11 months I had known her, she was not performing anything. She was just a woman standing in the wreckage of a story she had told herself for a very long time. I do not say that with satisfaction. I say it because it was the most honest moment I witnessed in that entire garden. Ethan had stopped trying to collect the scattered bank documents. He was sitting in the grass near the base of the altar steps, his formal wear collecting the morning dew, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone doing a very slow and very painful accounting. He did not try to approach me again. I think on some level, underneath everything, he understood that the gap between what he had believed about me and what I actually was had always been too wide to bridge, and that the distance was his own construction. My security team moved Gerald and Margaret toward the exit with professional quietness. Ethan followed without being asked. The remaining guests were already dispersing, conversations happening in tight urgent clusters, phones out, the afternoon's social architecture already being reconstructed around the new reality. The federal vehicles were pulling away with Dominic in the back of one of them. The string quartet's chairs sat empty near the oak trees. I stood at the altar for a moment after everyone had gone. The garden was genuinely beautiful in its emptiness. White petals on blue stone. Morning light coming through the oaks at a low angle. The scent of roses without the noise of the occasion they had been brought in to decorate. Marcus appeared at my elbow and handed me the status summary without comment, which was exactly the right instinct. I read it, handed it back, and walked down the aisle. The Vericore IPO was 30 days out. Sandra had 3 items on the morning agenda that needed my attention before noon. The car was at the rear gate with the engine running. The thing I kept returning to, in the days that followed, was not the recordings or the documents or the federal arrest or the pearls on the ground. It was the drive back to Hartford the night of that first dinner, when Ethan refilled his wine glass instead of saying anything, and I sat in the passenger seat watching the highway lights and told myself it was probably nothing. The most useful skill I developed in the aftermath of all this was not strategy or research or patience. It was the willingness to trust what I already knew. I had known something was wrong long before I had proof of it. I had waited for the proof because acting without it felt dangerous. But sitting with the knowledge and doing nothing with it had its own cost, and I paid it over 11 months in small, invisible installments. I do not tell the story as a triumph exactly. I tell it as an accurate account of what happens when you spend too long making yourself smaller than you are for the comfort of people who are threatened by your actual size. The Caldwells needed me to be struggling because it was the only version of me that their version of themselves could accommodate. When I stopped providing that version, they had nothing left to work with. That was not my victory. That was just the truth, finally taking up the space it had always been owed.